What if I told you that in 1961, while NASA was still figuring out how to get a man to the moon, Chrysler was already building spaceships and trying to sell them as luxury cars? I'm talking about a luxury car with a square steering wheel, a dashboard that looked like it belonged in a rocket command center, and a literal periscope gadget to dim the headlights. Oh, and the speedometer? That was a drum that rotated like you were checking fuel levels on the Apollo capsule. This wasn't some concept car locked away in a museum. Chrysler actually mass-produced these things and expected rich Americans to trade in their Cadillacs for them. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. But the story of why it failed is way more entertaining than you'd think. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1960s, and Chrysler has a problem. Actually, they have the problem that every car company not named General Motors had back then. Cadillac was absolutely dominating the luxury car market. Cadillac wasn't just a car, it was the status symbol. If you made it in America, you bought a Cadillac. End of story. But Chrysler wasn't about to roll over. They had the Imperial, a brand they'd been positioning as their Cadillac killer since 1955. And heading into the 60s, they decided to go all in with a strategy that can only be described as, let's out-Cadillac Cadillac by building something so futuristic, so over-the-top, so weird that luxury buyers will have no choice but to notice us. The Imperial should have been a winner. It had the engineering, the craftsmanship, the attention to detail, but it also had something else. A design philosophy that looked less like luxury car and more like, what if Buck Rogers designed a living room on wheels? And that's where things get interesting. Chrysler's plan was simple. If Cadillac was going to dominate with elegance and tradition, Imperial would dominate with innovation. They wanted to build a car that felt like it was from the future, a rolling showcase of everything American engineering could do. And to be fair, they kind of succeeded. The problem, they succeeded too well. See, luxury car buyers in 1961 weren't exactly begging for radical change. These were people who wanted leather, chrome, and a sense that they'd made it. They wanted their neighbors to be jealous, sure, but they also wanted to feel comfortable, familiar, safe. Chrysler said, how about a square steering wheel? Yeah, we need to talk about that. Let's start with the elephant in the room, or should I say, the square in the room. The 1961 Imperial came with a square steering wheel. Not rectangular, not oval, square. With rounded corners, sure, but still fundamentally a four-sided shape that your hands had absolutely no idea what to do with. Chrysler's reasoning: they claimed it gave you a better view of the instrument panel and made getting in and out of the car easier. Which, fine, maybe it did, but it also made you feel like you were piloting a forklift at a warehouse instead of cruising down Main Street in a $6,000 luxury car. But the steering wheel was just the beginning. The speedometer wasn't a traditional dial. Oh no, it was a rotating drum that spun horizontally behind a little window. You'd glance down and see your speed rolling by like you were reading ticker tape. It looked cool in a NASA control room kind of way, but in practice, good luck reading that thing at a glance while merging onto the highway. Therefore, Chrysler added a bunch of other space-age touches to justify the weirdness. There were pop-up air vents that rose out of the dashboard like little periscopes when you turned them on. There was a push-button transmission mounted on the left side of the dash, because why use a gear lever like a peasant when you could press buttons like you're launching a satellite? Oh, and here's my favorite, the autopilot. No, not that kind of autopilot. This was Chrysler's early cruise control system, but they called it autopilot because subtlety was not in the vocabulary in 1961. You'd set your speed, and the car would maintain it.
Revolutionary? Sure, but also kind of hilarious when you realize they named it like they expected you to take your hands off the wheel and read a newspaper. And if you optioned the dual-zone air conditioning, which was genuinely ahead of its time, you got separate controls for the driver and passenger. Fancy, right? Except the controls looked like something you'd use to adjust the cabin pressure on a submarine. But the absolute wildest feature, the automatic headlight dimmer. Most cars back then had a foot switch to toggle between high beams and low beams. The Imperial had a periscope-type sensor mounted on the dashboard that would detect oncoming headlights and automatically dim your beams for you. In theory, this was genius. In practice, it was a weird little tube sticking up from your dash that made passengers ask, "Why does your car have a periscope?" And you'd have to explain, "Oh, that's so I don't have to dim my own headlights like some kind of animal." Okay, so the interior was weird, but surely the outside of the car was normal, right? Not even close. The early 60s Imperials were designed by Elwood Engel, who would later go on to design the Lincoln Continental. But before he figured out restraint, he was working at Chrysler during the tail end of the Finn era, and boy did he commit to the bit.
The 1961 Imperial had freestanding taillights that jutted out from the body like little rocket pods. The rear end looked like it was ready to achieve liftoff. Fins weren't just styling cues, they were statements. They said, "I have arrived and I have done so from the year 2000. Up front, you had these concave, recessed headlights that looked like the car was squinting at you. They were technically called floating headlights because they sat in these deeply sculpted cavities. It was dramatic. It was bold. It was also kind of unsettling if you stared at it too long. And the grille? Massive, chrome, aggressive. It looked like the car was about to eat a Volkswagen Beetle for breakfast. But here's the thing. By 1963, Chrysler started to panic. Sales weren't where they needed to be. The spaceship vibe wasn't resonating. Therefore, Elwood Engel toned everything down. The fins got smaller, the dashboard got more conventional, the square steering wheel was quietly retired. The Imperial started looking more like, well, a normal luxury car. And in doing so, it lost the one thing that made it special. Its absolute commitment to being weird. So why did the Imperial fail? It wasn't the quality. These cars were incredibly well built. Chrysler used body-on-frame when Cadillac was moving to unibody. The ride was smooth, the engines were powerful, the interiors were genuinely luxurious. Weird, sure, but luxurious. The problem was perception. Cadillac had decades of prestige behind it. When you bought a Cadillac, you were buying into a legacy. It was safe, it was understood, it was expected. The Imperial, on the other hand, felt like a gamble. It was the car that tried too hard, the car that showed up to the country club in a metallic silver suit when everyone else was wearing navy blue. Luxury buyers didn't want to be confused by their car. They didn't want to explain the square steering wheel or the periscope dimmer. They wanted elegance, not experimentation. And so, year after year, Cadillac outsold Imperial by enormous margins. By the mid-70s, the Imperial name was discontinued. It came back briefly in the 80s as a front-wheel drive coupe, but that's a tragedy for another video. But, and this is a big but, today the story is different. Collectors and enthusiasts now look at these early 60s Imperials as rolling art. They represent an era when American car companies weren't afraid to take massive, ridiculous swings, when playing it safe wasn't in the playbook. The square steering wheel? Iconic. The drum speedometer? A conversation starter. The space-age design? A reminder that sometimes the craziest ideas are the most memorable. The Imperial didn't beat Cadillac, but it did something arguably more important. It became unforgettable. So here's the question I want you to think about. Would you rather drive a Cadillac that everyone loved and understood, Or an Imperial spaceship that nobody quite got but that turned heads everywhere it went? Because here's the truth, the Imperial wasn't a failure of engineering or craftsmanship. It was a failure of timing. It was a car built for people who didn't exist yet. People who wanted their cars to be weird, bold, and unapologetically different. Maybe Chrysler was just 60 years too early. If you loved this ride through automotive madness, hit that subscribe button because trust me, we've got even crazier stories coming. From forgotten oddballs to legendary icons, we're diving deep into the cars that shaped America, one strange decision at a time. Thanks for watching. Now go tell someone about the square steering wheel. They won't believe you.